Good morning. So welcome to the Dream Edit. This is our very first podcast episode. We are ridiculously excited to be joined by Patricia Daly, who's an advanced nutritional therapist specializing in the application of the ketogenic lifestyle. So anyone who's familiar with the Dream Edit knows that we are huge fans of ketogenic and low carb living. So Patricia, thank you very much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Hi, Wendy. Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great honor to be the first podcast guest, and delighted to be here and talking to you.
Okay, amazing. Well, do you want to give us like a quick overview of like your position in the industry and kind of more on your area of expertise?
Yeah, sure. So I basically was dragged into the world of ketogenic metabolic therapies, as we like to call it, I started researching in 2010. And followed Professor Tom Seyfried's work very closely, Dom D'Agostino, the very early influencers. I don't like the word influencer, but there are scientists and professors, and discovered that there is something really amazing, or rediscovered actually. The ketogenic metabolic approach is quite an old one, actually. It's over 100 years old, and ketogenic diets have been used to treat epilepsy, in particular in children and in adults, especially refractory epilepsy when medication doesn't work, for a very long time. So we have a lot of clinical experience. We have a lot of research, especially when it comes to the brain. We know that this approach is safe and it can be effective. And it's really the last few years have uncovered so much that we sort of knew from clinical practice, that they bring improvements, but now they are finally also doing the randomized controlled trials to actually hopefully bring all these therapies into the standard of care, because quite a lot of illnesses, especially also when we talk about polycystic kidney disease, PKD, or also chronic kidney conditions, where we know these people cannot really be effectively, efficiently helped with medication in the long term, that this is a very promising area. Mental health is a super promising area. And of course, where I come from, that brought me into this field is oncology. Cancer. So I had ocular melanoma in 2008. I was diagnosed when I was in my late 20s, and had 2 relapses. And in 2012, especially also after studying the early research and cancer as a metabolic disease by Tom Seyfried, I decided to go that route with the support of my consultant, my ophthalmologist here in Dublin as well. I didn't do anything silly, but I was literally in a corner. It was a matter of removing the eye or trying some injections, or just doing something completely different. And I went for the third option. We said, what do I have to lose? Let's see how this goes. And it hits the nail on its head, thank goodness. So since 2012 now, I haven't had any relapses. The tumor is shrinking. I mean, it's obviously very hard to get rid of necrotic, so dead cells in the eye, but it's really nicely shrinking, and I managed to preserve my eyesight and got rid of astigmatism and all these lovely other positive side effects that the ketogenic metabolic approach brought me. So that's in a nutshell.
Amazing, Patricia. Because I mean, most people would know ketogenic, or if they're familiar with it, they would know it as a weight loss tool. And, it is very effective when done correctly for the person's body, definitely. But not many people know it for being a lifestyle. And I like to say lifestyle as opposed to diet, because there's a lot more to it,
Yes.
In general, like as a lifestyle for keeping inflammation low in the body and for treating disease. So your story is like absolutely fascinating, and my particular area is the area of ketogenic living and mental health, and the balancing the blood sugars and importance of it. And again, anyone familiar with Dream Edit knows when I talk about, ketogenic living, it would be a huge factor, would be balancing blood sugars. Do you want to tell us like a little bit more about the benefits of balancing blood sugars for mental health in general?
Yeah, sure. And I also mostly refer to the experts in this field, because I'm not trained in in mental health. I just know about quite a lot about brain biochemistry, and especially also what we have learned from epilepsy. So what we have learned from epilepsy and the ketogenic diet is that ketone bodies that are a byproduct of following a specific type of diet, and that can look very different from person to person. That's the interesting and important thing to understand. There are as many ketogenic approaches as there are people doing it. So a ketogenic diet is any intervention, and as you mentioned as well, lifestyle, we can help with our lifestyle big time as well. That helps us produce ketone bodies, and ketone bodies are a byproduct of fat metabolism. So if we start to use fatty acids instead of glucose as our main fuel, and the brain obviously cannot transport, or we cannot transport fatty acids across the blood-brain barrier. So we need ketones that actually diffuse very easily into the brain to make sure our brain doesn't starve and our brain has an alternative fuel if glucose is very sparse, i.e. if we don't eat a lot of carbs, or in the past, if we had a famine. So the human species wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the amazing ability of a lot of our cells, most of our cells, to burn not just glucose, but to also burn fatty acids and or ketones. And this is really very important to understand that, you know, there are lots of different ways of doing keto. And what we know from epilepsy is the calming effect of ketone bodies. So that was a long way around to explain what ketone bodies are. And ultimately, that calming effect that has helped, and we still aren't 100% sure actually what the exact mechanisms are in epilepsy. We have the randomized controlled trials. We know it works for a lot of people if it's done right, but that's obviously also something we can use for general mental health conditions. So experts like Harvard-trained psychiatrist Georgia Ede, who is actually just publishing a book in January, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. I did the meal plans for this book. And also Chris Palmer. He has a book called Brain Energy. He's also Harvard trained, and there's an amazing research center in Edinburgh where Ian Campbell is the lead PhD, and they are doing amazing research, not just into, just quote, things like depression or anxiety, but they're going after bipolar disease, especially refractory, again, not responding to medication, schizophrenia, and really hard to treat conditions. And what especially Georgia Ede talks a lot about as well is that there is a clear connection between our mental health and our physical health. And so far, that interestingly, surprisingly, I don't know how that happened, has always been disconnected. We just, in psychiatry, they mostly looked at just the brain, what's happening in the brain, what's happening to neurotransmitters, but the rest of the body was sort of completely ignored, and especially metabolic health of our entire being. And metabolic health is absolutely key for brain health. And they are proving now in those studies that there is this link. So especially also glucose, as you just mentioned. So we have blood glucose that we can measure, for instance, with a glucometer like this one here. It's very simple. You prick your finger. You get the result within 5 seconds what your glucose is in the blood, your circulating glucose. And our body generally likes it to be around 1 teaspoon, around the 5 millimole per liter that circulates in our blood. If it goes up a lot, it also goes up in the brain. So we know that's a clear connection. The big issue is then insulin. So insulin is like your traffic controller that actually decides what happens to the different metabolic substrates. So do we store glucose? Do we use glucose for energy? And what happens there? And insulin, as we know now, cannot easily get into the brain, especially also in mental health conditions. So our brain gets flooded with glucose, and insulin isn't there to actually help the glucose go into the cell. And of course, that's panic mode for the brain. So it's this, the brain swimming in a sea of glucose, but the cells are also insulin resistant, partly, and that can cause a lot of issues that can be the underlying cause of a lot of mental health disorders. And so looking at insulin is really important, and not just focusing on the glucose.
The importance of becoming insulin sensitive, is like, it's phenomenal in terms of health. Again, as to echo what you said, brain health, do you want to just give us a couple of different ways of becoming more insulin sensitive, and what are the best ways that someone can do it?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways. Reducing carbohydrates is the most obvious one, because we know that the eating quite a lot of carbohydrates, or all of the three macros, carbs, protein, and fat, carbs has the biggest impact, or the biggest trigger for insulin. And the problem with insulin resistance is it doesn't happen overnight. It's not just some disease, but it happens over a long, long time if we constantly eat foods that trigger insulin on a very regular basis. So most people, if they have, I'll give you an example, very simple, cereals, toast, and orange juice for breakfast, their glucose will spike. It will go up very rapidly and pretty high. That depends a bit on the individual. Insulin comes in because it's danger. It's a danger for our brain, for our eyes, for all the fine capillaries. If glucose goes too high, we want to avoid that. Insulin comes in and makes sure that the glucose gets either into the cell for energy generation, or it gets stored, but it has to be removed from the bloodstream. And then, so that happens, and then insulin is so effective at doing its job that quite often the glucose just dips very quickly. And that's when people have cravings. That's when they need their morning coffee. So they maybe have a Mars bar and a coffee, and we start again. And same then for lunch, even carbohydrates from what people think, porridge, or the high fiber breads. Fiber can slow glucose down a little bit, but for somebody who has lost the ability to respond appropriately to insulin, they will go sky high, even with complex carbs. So that's a bit of a misleading notion that, I eat a lot of complex carbs, so whole grain pasta, whole grain rice, I don't eat any white carbs. Still, that in a lot of people, that will actually spike the glucose and then spike insulin. Whenever insulin spikes, it's a whole cascade of, pro-inflammation, mitochondrial issues, digestive issues, free radicals, and for most people, eating a lot of processed foods as well, eating just, not a balanced macronutrient ratio. They are on this blood sugar roller coaster quite often for years or decades, until we can actually detect that there is an issue. And the issues can be a whole range of metabolic conditions. I mean, it's quite incredible how we are finding now through studies that addressing metabolic health by becoming carb savvy, by testing your individual response, because it is individual. Some people think, oh my God, I'm eating amazingly well and I eat according to the food pyramid. It simply doesn't work for many people. I mean, studies show now in the US, 93% of the population have lost their metabolic flexibility. They have a metabolic dysfunction of some sort. So that's just mind-blowing. So starting to measure a few things, getting some labs done as well, ideally, and starting to track. You can also have the CGM, a continuous glucose monitor. That's quite a lot of fun to just see, if I eat that, what happens? and starting to play around and be really curious what your blood glucose is doing. And also looking at symptoms like how do you feel before and after a meal. That's quite a good sign as well. What happens when you do have food? All that should happen is you're not hungry anymore. There shouldn't be any other side effects of eating. You shouldn't be tired. You shouldn't get more energy. How do you sleep? What happens in the afternoon? How is your energy throughout the day? How is your mood? Are you very reactive? Do you get hungry? Do you have to eat every 3 hours? Because that's what we learned in college quite a long time ago in 2008. For blood sugar balancing, you have to eat every 3 hours. And again, not necessarily a good idea. For most people, it's not a good idea. Prolonging your fast can also really help regaining your insulin sensitivity. But again, I am a bit cautious, especially with women. Women sometimes overdo it on fasting and then put a spanner in their hormonal health as well. But calming down insulin has so many benefits. It's actually mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. Like when, even when clients come into my clinic and we look at balancing the blood sugars, without having it too complex, it's just incredible. Like even the whole idea of like mastering your breakfast. I'm always telling my clients, master your breakfast. So many people are on porridge and then they're kind of hungry and they're crashing like 2 hours later. And I know myself, when I track my own glucose after having porridge, my blood sugar, it shoots up. Like, massively. But if I have like fiber, fat, and protein for breakfast, it's a completely different story altogether.
Yeah.
So in terms of like kind of glucose hacks that, a practical application for people that they can do on a daily basis, like what are like the biggest ones that you'd recommend?
Yeah. So one that can work really well, as you just said, it's also looking at your, first of all, macronutrient composition. So most people, I find, actually don't eat enough protein. And even on a ketogenic diet, I think 10, 12 years ago, we would have said, you really need to pull back on your protein to gain or go into ketosis. I just don't really see that happening in real life. I don't find protein has a massive impact on blood glucose or ketosis. Again, it's individual, of course. But starting your meal with, in general, with fiber as well, if you tolerate it. And then moving on to protein. And if you do have carbs, to have them towards the end of the meal. There's a lovely study actually comparing the exact same meal, but just looking at the carbohydrate sequence, and the difference between insulin and also glucose is mind-blowing. So if you start with the carb or you start with the fiber, really big difference. So, and also including, as you say, getting rid of our fat phobia. That was one of my biggest things, because I was always low fat and vegan for a time as well in my teens, and super high carb. I was an athlete. So for me, getting over that fat phobia, it's not going to kill me if it's the right fat, and it's actually hugely beneficial. That's a biggie. So protein and fat, and again, for glucose management, if you can, 3 square meals to start with. If you're used to snacking a lot, that's a really good way as well. In terms of managing your glucose, there are some things as well, of course, with exercise. Exercise is a really big metabolic intervention as well, if it's done right, because when our muscles contract, we actually don't require insulin to get the glucose into the cells, namely also the muscle cells. And the muscle cells are quite big users of glucose. And so tagging on exercise to quite a carb-heavy meal can actually also make a big difference. And there's also things like using apple cider vinegar for some people. That makes a big impact as well. Before a meal, 20 minutes before a meal, with some fiber, for instance, to just put a little bit of a floor into the stomach there of fiber and apple cider vinegar, or making a dressing with apple cider vinegar. And sleep is a glucose hack as well. working on your sleep and making sure that, you know, you detect why your sleep might be disrupted, and because that's a big contributor to insulin resistance as well, which then will hijack your glucose efforts during the day as well. So these are sort of the main ones.
Yeah, it's amazing because obviously, you know, there's a lot of focus when it comes to ketogenic living on the actual food itself. But really, you know, when you look at it from like a lifestyle perspective, exactly, it's the sleep, it's the stress level, you know, even cortisol shoots up glucose, you know, like somebody can be on like a very strict ketogenic diet, but can't necessarily get in ketosis or stay in ketosis because their stress level's too high, you know. So they're brilliant tips, Patricia, because you know, it really is looking at the person like as a whole and their lifestyle in general. Patricia, thank you so much for that. You know, if anyone wants to know more about Patricia, the website is on the screen. Check out her cookbook, The Ketogenic Kitchen. It is by far my favorite cookbook I've ever picked up. Yeah, go on, Patricia.
I have it, yeah, with Dominique Kemp, and yeah, we're still very much plotting, and maybe there's a second one coming at some point.
Oh God, your first.
But we don't know. We can't make any promises. So
you're a busy woman. And again, Patricia, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're busy, so I'm incredibly grateful. It was amazing to talk to you.
Yeah, no problem at all. It was great to connect and meet you. Thank you so much. Bye.